Hello everybody, welcome to the Jacob Böhme exhibition at the Embassy of the Free Mind in Amsterdam. My name is Lucinda Martin. I'm one of the 3 curators. My colleagues are Claudia Brink and Cecilia Muratori. And this is a joint project of the Embassy of the Free Mind and the State Art Collections in Dresden. So what I want to talk to you about today is the visionary thinker Jacob Böhme. Most people don't know who Böhme was, but he's been incredibly influential on religion, on science, on philosophy, on art, on poetry. So I just want to introduce you to him briefly today. We see here a couple of portraits of Böhme. The most famous one is this one of Böhme sitting in a shoemaker's shop, because Böhme was a simple cobbler. We don't really know how much education Böhme had, but he seems to have been self-educated. He lived in the town of rlitz, which was on the German-Polish border. And that at the time was a crossroads of peoples, of religions, and was also an exciting idea where the new sciences of astronomy and alchemy were blossoming. So Böhme seems to have absorbed a lot of these ideas from his environment. And we know that around 1600, he had a kind of visionary experience. And he says he carried this experience with him for 12 years before he was finally able to put pen to paper. And we see here that's exactly what he's doing. He's writing, and he's quite literally turned his back on his cobbler's bench. So this was the beginning of Böhme dedicating himself to his writing. In this other portrait, this is from the 17th century, and we see Böhme looking very robust, very perhaps wealthy, as almost like a Dutch businessman. And this is because Böhme became very, very popular among the free-thinking society of 18th century Amsterdam. And this was partly because many religious refugees from Germany and other countries came here, and they were inspired by Böhme's writings about religious free-thinking. Another interesting thing about this portrait is that it describes him as the Teutonicus, the German philosopher. And this was important because up to this time, philosophy could only be written in Latin, and Böhme was one of the first to really write a complicated, profound philosophy in his native language. So the interesting thing about Böhme's philosophy is that it's a universal philosophy. He tries to bring together all of the different branches of thought in his time. So, for example, lots of new discoveries were being made about new continents, new peoples, new religions, also in the sciences. And this disrupted and disturbed a lot of people. But Böhme believed that this simply means that we haven't understood these things yet, and we haven't understood how they fit together in one divine plan. So the first sentence of his writing career begins with his statement that he wants to bring these together. I compare the whole of philosophy, astrology, and theology, together with their mother, to a delightful tree that grows in a beautiful garden of delights. So philosophy, astrology, and theology as the 3 main branches of thought in Böhme's time. So Böhme's thought is actually the blueprint of our exhibition. If you take a look at the floor plan, you'll see a very interesting design with lots of different words, with a dark half and a light half, and with a heart in the center. And this is coming from a sketch that Böhme himself made in his writing, 40 Questions for the Soul. So it's maybe important to mention that Böhme started his whole exploration of philosophical ideas with a moment where he says he saw the light gleaming off of a metal container. And in this moment, he understood you can only see the light because of the darkness, okay, this moment of reflection. And he sees this within every living thing and within everything in the cosmos. So, for example, the dark and the light exist in human beings, And in the human heart, we decide on a moral level between these two. So walking through the exhibition, we have different cases highlighting different aspects of Böhme's thought. And in this particular case, we highlight the influences. So they include things as diverse as the writings of Martin Luther, but also the writings of Paracelsus, very important as an early physician. And you see his portrait in this case. We also have a book, Wasserstein der Weisen, which highlights the search for the so-called philosopher's stone in Böhme's time. And again, it's this idea of bringing religion and science together. We see in the frontispiece an image of a candle and a reference to the Bible, to a verse that talks about bringing light into darkness. And in this case, it would be science bringing light into darkness. So here we actually have a copy of the book 40 Questions that contains the drawing that Böhme conceived of, which is serving as the blueprint for our exhibition. And you can see that it's a very interesting kind of fold out in this particular book. And here you have a better overview, perhaps, of the so-called philosophical sphere, or Böhme also called it the wonder eye, the Wunderauge of eternity. And here you see lots of different terms sort of plotted on these two axes. You can think of the two axes in almost a mathematical way, and he did think of it very scientifically. And these terms, again, tried to bring together religious terms like heaven and hell and father and son, but also words from science like element or tincture. And Böhme hoped to find one system that would combine all of these things. I mentioned before that Böhme had influenced many thinkers of later times, and one of them was the English poet and artist William Blake. So we have here a book illustrated by Blake with a very large image of fallen angels and demons and lots of sort of apocalyptic things going on. And this is also a very important idea in Böhme's time, because throughout the entire early modern period, from 1500 to 1800, many people thought that the world would soon end and that they had to prepare for that time. And Böhme's philosophy, of course, arises in this context, and he wants to help people create a new world. So he's not about the doom, he's about the rebirth, and I'll say more about rebirth later. So this wall is actually also a really good example of how Böhme tried to bring together all of these different elements in one system. This is an illustration from Dionysius Andreas Freyer, who lived in the late 17th century and was a very important interpreter of Böhme, who went from Germany to the Netherlands to England, searching for like-minded people to try to help him understand Böhme. But he also produced wonderful pictures like this, where he first of all represents Böhme's idea of the so-called three principles. So I've mentioned the light and the dark, but Böhme imagines that the darkness is actually what we usually think of as God the Father, a principle in the cosmos. Then the second principle he calls Christ, the light, what we think of as Jesus, the historical Jesus. And then the third principle would be our material world, where these two come together in the human being. So this is a representation of those three worlds, but you see that Freyer tries to bring in lots of other things that are encoded in Böhme's system. We see astrological symbols for the different planets. We see things from the Bible, for example, the A for Adam, and it's here at the bottom because Adam fell, Adam committed sin. We have above, way up high, a U and an M. Those are the archangels, Uriel and Michael. And in the center, we have the symbols, the initials of Jesus Christ, over the six-pointed star. And the six-pointed star was itself also a very important symbol at this time of religious power. So bringing all of this together in one system. So now I'd like to get into the nitty-gritty of Böhme's thought and to some of his ideas that made him quite controversial in his time. And one of those was his idea of the divine Sophia, or divine wisdom. Now, remember I mentioned that for Böhme, God encompasses everything, the hot, the cold, the male, the female, and so forth. So for Böhme, God cannot be only male. God has to have a female element. And indeed, Böhme looks in the history of Christianity and he finds that early Christians actually believed in a person in the Godhead called Sophia, or wisdom, who was God's mechanism for creation. And this, of course, is also reflected in scriptures. If you read, for example, in Ecclesiastes, there are statements like, I, wisdom, was with the Father from the beginning. And in the original scriptures, this I is a female voice. So Böhme takes this idea and he does a lot with it. And we see here actually a very beautiful illustration from the 18th century, from a Rosicrucian manuscript, the Virgin Sophia wearing a crown, and she has a skirt made up of medallions with many different little symbols. And again, those are the many, many aspects of creation for which Sophia is responsible. Now in this case, we've highlighted the themes of birth and rebirth, or creation and recreation in Böhme. And in a way, you can see his whole philosophy as being about creation and recreation happening over and over again in the cosmos. So I'd like to begin by talking about the creation of the cosmos itself. Now, Böhme actually wants to get back behind the creation of the world and the universe to the emergence of God himself. So this is, again, another idea that made Böhme very controversial in his time. So Böhme reads in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it says, in the beginning there was darkness on the deep. And he imagines a kind of deep darkness out of which God the Father emerged. And he says that this is the great mystery, actually, that within this darkness, within this void, there was a kind of self-consciousness or a self-awareness. And he calls this self-awareness, or this moment, the looking in the mirror. And it's again Sophia, the female element within this darkness that somehow allows him to become aware, that he becomes aware of himself. And that then sets in motion a series of creations, or you can say a series of looking in the mirror, which creates all of the things of our universe. Because this God wanted to know more and more about himself. And so we have a process, what Böhme describes as a process of differentiation, where all of the stars are created, the planets, the animals, down to the tiniest creatures in the cosmos. And you see here in this book by Böhme's colleague Robert Flood, who lived about the same time as Böhme, this moment of light in darkness. And you see the word fiat, let it be. So this is the moment when consciousness arises and God sets creation in motion. Now I want to spring forward about a century to the followers and the readers of Böhme. They were very inspired by his ideas about birth and also spiritual rebirth and how to achieve it. Böhme talks about us getting back to an original state of innocence. And he talks about that being a battle that we have to fight within. And it's really only in an afterlife that humans can ever achieve some kind of perfection. And this perfection, interestingly, for Böhme, means going back to the image of God. Yeah, the Bible says that human beings were created in the image of God. But this is where it gets interesting. Don't forget that Böhme said that God is both male and female. So Böhme's followers began thinking, how can this work? Does that mean we're all going to have male, female bodies? Well, indeed, yes. Except that Böhme wasn't thinking of a physical body. Böhme was thinking of a spiritual body. He was thinking of us being something like angels and having male and female aspects within us. Now, Böhme's followers in later centuries actually wrote writings and created sketches to try to figure out how these bodies would look, and some of them even believed that the changes could begin during mortal life. We see here, for example, an image of darkness and light within the human being. And in this image, we finally see Sophia over the heart, because Sophia has returned to the human being. He has suppressed the darkness and will be reborn. I've already mentioned several controversial ideas that Böhme had, but perhaps the most controversial was his idea that all human beings have this second principle of light within them, which in essence means that all human beings are capable of higher levels of thinking, and they're capable of making good decisions. So he asks, for example, Christians, Jews, Turks, and heathens are all your siblings, or do you think that God is only the God of Christians? Now, this idea inspired many thinkers throughout the centuries. Beginning in Böhme's time, of course, there was a lot of concentration on the idea of rebirth and what happens in the human heart, and how can we reach this state of goodness that Böhme talks about. So, for example, you see wonderful fold-out images like this, where you see the heart going from completely dark to partially dark, until in the end it's finally completely illuminated. Now, again here we see another example of engagement with Böhme's idea of rebirth, perhaps the most artistic one. What Freyer has done here is create many layers that you can open to see the different stages of rebirth, the different stages of human improvement to reach this original state that we had. And I think one of the most interesting things you see is that the deeper you go within the human being, the more you get down to the cosmic level. So at a certain level, you get back to the cosmos itself. And this is the idea that each human being contains everything in the cosmos, and the cosmos contains everything in the human being. So in addition to all of the beautiful books in the Rittman collection, we've also created several digital exhibits. And one of them is Böhme's first work, his Aurora, so that visitors can actually touch this touch screen and they can see on one side Böhme's actual handwriting, and on the other side they can see a translation in modern German, English, or Dutch. And there are also little explanations and pictures to help you put it all in context. And here you have highlighted a little section about rebirth. And he says, "Wake up, the hour of your rebirth is at hand, the day is dawning, the morning glow is appearing." And of course, in his writings, this idea of the morning, the aurora, comes up again and again. So here we're back again at the cosmic level. But for Böhme, the cosmic and the human are very much entwined, the microcosm and the macrocosm, meaning that everything that's in the universe, everything that's in God, is within the human being, including this original freedom, the ability to choose, the conscience. And this is, of course, what separates human beings from other animals, and it's what connects us to God. And the important thing is, of course, that this doesn't just apply to European Christians, which made it very controversial in Böhme's time. It means that Muslims, that Jews, that American Indians, who had just been discovered at that time, that they all have this original freedom within them. So long before the Enlightenment of the 18th century, we have radical religious thinkers like Böhme pointing to this humanity in all of us and saying race, gender, your social class, those are all outer characteristics. The most important thing in every human being that ties us to the divinity is our inner character.